Lloyd Cornelison. I'm here together with Bill Gundari Echtungs, Global College Office Coordinator and Human Rights Department Assistant. I want to talk about Global College generally, but more importantly about the Human Rights Program in particular, because that's probably the program you'd be most interested in. The other two programs we have are graduate master's programs. And so I want to talk about the Human Rights Program. And before I do that, I want to tell you about an experience I had a few years ago that probably, more than any that I can remember or have experienced, informs our conversation on human rights. It was an experience I had in Calcutta in India a few years ago. I was doing some research at a school in downtown Calcutta, and it was about a 1.5 hour walk to the hotel that I stayed in. And rather than take a tuk-tuk or a taxi or a bus to and from the school, I walked. I enjoyed walking. And the second to last day that I was there in Calcutta, the school was just a block away from, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mother Teresa and her Sisters of Charity. And I'm walking along, it's a very busy street. It's about the size of Portage Avenue, about as wide as Portage Avenue. Sidewalks are much wider, and then there was, of course, a lot more going on in those streets than on those sidewalks than on sidewalks here. There were people buying and selling food and people living on the street. It's my second to last day. I'm walking down the street. I see this tarp draped over a stanchion, a metal fence that separated the sidewalk from the street. And as I'm walking up to it, I keep walking, thinking this must be someone's home. And so without thinking, I sort of looked in, I kept on walking. And of course, I was right. It was someone's home. There was a mattress, there were pots and pans. And interestingly enough, there were some music CDs. I mean, it took all this in an instant, but as soon as I was past this tarp, there was a big booming voice right behind me, a very tall, skinny man, said, "You American, what are you doing here?" And as a Canadian, when we travel, we say, "Well, I'm not an American, I'm a Canadian." He said, "You North Americans, you're all the same." He said, "What are you doing here?" And I stopped and I told him. I said, "I'm just doing some research at the school down the way." And then, again, sort of without thinking, I just said, "So what are you doing here? Why are you here?" His partner, his wife, he looked to be about 30 years old, was sitting on her back. She was sitting on the concrete, her back, this fence that separated them from the busy street. She had their 2-year-old little boy on her lap. And he looked at me really interesting. I said, "So why are you here and how's that working out for you?" And he said, "The reason I'm here," he said, "is 2 years ago. I was teaching music. I was a music teacher." He said, "You notice the CDs in our house?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I was a music teacher in Bangladesh. I contracted HIV through an intravenous needle at a hospital where I was sick. I passed on the virus to my wife, pointed to his partner, and my unborn son. The school board found out about me having HIV. They fired me. And we did the only thing there was to do. We sold all of our possessions. And we bought 3 train tickets to the only HIV hospice in the world, in this part of the world, which is in Delhi." And he said, in Calcutta is just on the inside of the Indian Bangladesh border. He said, "When we crossed into India, Calcutta, we had to change trains." And he said, "We got in fairly late at night, and our train was leaving for Delhi the next morning. We stayed under the bridge. We couldn't afford a hotel. We stayed under the bridge, and I could see the bridge down the way." He said, "The next morning when we woke up, my best friend was gone, and he had taken all of our money and our train tickets." And he said, "That was just over 2 years ago, and we're still here looking to find our way to Delhi." And I don't know. I had one of those experiences where two worlds come crashing together, and I looked over to his partner who had their 2-year boy on her lap, and she was brushing that little boy's teeth with Colgate, something I've often done when my boys were small. And here we were. It was like, and then he jumped up, and but I'd been talking with this person for a while. We weren't first started. Like I called him Ivan, and I said, Ivan, your boys are anyway. And he ran off into this crowd of massive people, and he looked at me and said, Lloyd, he goes, that's my boy. He's a street kid. And that's something I often said about my two children. And sure enough, 20 minutes later, this little 2-year-old came out of this mass of people with a cookie in either hand. And he turned to me again and he said, that's my boy. I said, Ivan, what's the worst part of living on the street like this? He said, Friday nights, because that's when the young men on the street get drunk and they want to hurt my wife. And if I make a lot of noise, it scares them away. And he showed me this metal thing you pull out of the stanchion, you pull out of the fence. And I told him, I said, Ivan, I asked him, you got a rip in the fence, in your roof, in your tarp. There's the rainy season's coming. Rain's going to come through. And he said, oh yeah. He said, I didn't pay my taxes last month. I said, the city of Calcutta charges you taxes to live on the sidewalk? And he looked at me like I was kind of stupid. He goes, no. He says, the gangs run the sidewalks. They need protection money, and I didn't have enough money. I think it was 14 rupees to pay them, and this is a reminder to pay them next month. And we talked for a long time, and then finally I took my leave. It was starting to get a little dark, and I walked back to the hotel. It took me an hour or two, and I had dinner, and I couldn't get this conversation out of my mind. I decided to go back. Late at night, I picked my way through a lot of back lanes and streets, and I went back to this main street, and I found Ivan, just like he said, because it was very hot. It was a hot time of the year. It was August. He and his partner, the little boy, and about 14, 50 neighbors were all sleeping on the sidewalk. And when he saw me coming, he jumped up and he said, hey, Lloyd, it's good to see you. And I went to shake his hand, and I had enough rupees in the palm of my hand so that he could buy his plane tickets to Delhi. But in that instance, I knew I'd made a mistake, because there were 14 pairs of eyes that watched that transaction. Of course, the rule of the street is this money would be shared. And at that moment, I also thought to myself, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. Why am I here? Who am I? Am I some sort of white savior? What's happening? And I haven't been able to get that image out of my mind. And so when we talk about human rights, right? So here I am talking about human rights. There's a fundamental question. Is it okay that Ivan and Lloyd share the same world? I'm talking from a warm house, a room in the back of my house. And when I'm finished here today, I'm going to go eat and I'm going to drink, and that's never a concern. Is it okay that Ivan and Lloyd share the same planet? And most societies in the world would say there's an injustice here. There's a problem. And I think it's that problem that we in human rights look to understand. So Dory, if you want to change the slide to the next slide. And then change it one more time. Here are a list of sample courses. And in all of these courses, we're looking basically to understand what it means. What rights should be shared by everybody in the world by virtue of their humanity, and how are those understood differently in different parts of the world? or who you are. You may see human rights differently if you've grown up in Calcutta than if you grew up in Winnipeg, or if you're a man or you're a woman, or there are different sexual orientations, different ableisms. What are the sort of the basic rights that should be shared by everyone, and how is it understood differently? And if we can come up with a set of shared rights, how are they implemented? So if you take a look at the sample courses, we've got Introduction to Global Citizenship, Concepts of Conventions, History of Human Rights, Colonization, Introduction to Women's and Gender Studies. There's another course, Local and International Practicum in Human Rights. If you take a 4-year program in human rights, you need to do a practicum. Basically what that is like basically asking the question. So if we understand human rights to be all these sorts of things, and we understand that through concepts we learn in the classroom, what does it really mean in the real world? And so you're going to be asked, if you choose to do the program, students in this program are asked to do a practicum where they work either in a local organization, NGO, or nonprofit dealing with human rights, like the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, for example, or students can choose to do an international practicum where they would work with an NGO anywhere or somewhere in the world. And we've had students in places doing their practicums in places like Thailand, Guatemala, Cambodia, Ghana, because that is where the idea is tested in the real world. And then coming back after that, and there's the one course called Capstone Human Rights, where sort of all of what students have learned through their courses and through their practicums are sort of looked at in that final course. Now, a question that a lot of people have is, so we learn these things about human rights, and we have all of a course of 3 or 4 years. What is it that I can do with this degree? And just the last 2 weeks, we hired someone to take a look at and ask former graduates from our program, what is it they did with this program, with this degree in human rights? And what Dari is showing there is a lot of potential careers, but those careers are examples of that we took from the study that we did in the last couple of weeks. So we've got potential careers, and then on the next slide, some work settings that people are now working in, and skills and expertise they say they learned through taking those sorts of courses that they're doing. Now, we're going to go on to the next slide in a second. You may not have time to see that whole list, but if you go into the chat room, we can sort of revisit that list. And then finally, to sort of end the presentation, here are 3 or 4 or 5 quotes from students who have taken our program. Again, these are students that after the fact, that after they graduated, this is what they said about their time in the program and in Global College generally. Now, I could go on and on and on. I am deeply invested in the program. I think it's a really important program. I think you're going to find it really interesting and fascinating, and you're going to meet some of the most interesting people in the world through the program. But that's what we have the chat room for, and that's where people, you're going to meet people like Dari and other folks like a guy called Flavio, who are going to be there to answer any particular questions you might have. So see you in the chat room in a little while if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd, for the presentation. I've just stopped sharing and hopefully we are back here.
Yes, I was going to say one more thing. Dari, who's been so eloquent in sharing the slides, has a few things to say in terms of the chat room and who or what you might find there. So over to you, Dari.
Yeah, right. So everyone, welcome to join us in the chat room, and we have started the discussion room as well. So take your time to start the discussion and in your question. If we have time to answer, we'll answer your questions here. And And if not, we'll move on to our chat rooms. And I'm so happy to chat with you guys, with everyone individually. And there will be my colleague Flavio and our research assistant Jeffrey.
Right, so
All right.
wrap it up then, Jari, and head over to the chat room.
Okay, sure. Thanks for joining us. I see about 7 people watching us. So yeah, it was a great time being here. All right. Thanks for hosting us here.
Okay, great.
Yeah, in a